Welcome to The Art of Medicine, the program that explores the arts, business, and clinical aspects of the practice of medicine. I'm your host, Dr. Andrew Wilner. I like to feature authors on this program because I know how much work it requires to put a book together. Most people won't bother unless they have something really important to say. I've published 4 books and currently working on number 5, and it's not easy. So today, I'd like to welcome Marilyn Wooley, PhD, the author of How Heroes Heal. But before we get started, I'd like to thank our sponsor, locumstory.com. If you're considering locum tenens, either full-time or on the side, you probably have a question or two, or 20. Fortunately, locumstory.com has the answers you need. It's packed with unbiased information and advice from physicians like you. Locumstory.com has nothing to sell. It's simply a resource for information. You'll find super handy tools that let you see locums trends for your specialty, compare different locums agencies, and there's even a quiz to help you decide if locums is right for you. Locumstory.com is the perfect place to start if you want to learn more about locums. And now, without further ado, welcome Dr. Wooley.
Thank you. I'm so glad to be here. And so I am a psychologist, and I specialize in working with first responders, and I'm also a traumatologist. So first responders and trauma go together. I wrote this book called How Heroes Heal, and the subtitle is Stories of First Responders and Their Journey from Post-Traumatic Stress Injury to Post-Traumatic Growth. So there it is. And the beginnings of this book started with my grandfather. He was a brigadier general in World War II, and during his service, he went to Dachau, was one of the liberators of Dachau. In fact, there's a picture of him next to Hermann Goering when they arrested Hermann Goering, or they had the press conference. So he was always a very taciturn, quiet, kind of crabby guy. And that's what I grew up with. And I never really understood. He never talked about the war, World War II, never talked about the war. And I never understood until after my dad died. I found the trunk in the attic. And there were all the things from my grandfather's experiences during World War II. They're like literally probably 1,000 letters and the pictures of Dachau, which are horrific. So it kind of, I kind of started getting inkling of it. That was around the time that I was starting to work in traumatology. And I went to a conference in Baltimore where they were talking about post-traumatic stress injuries. And by the way, we're calling them injuries now because they happen from the outside. It's not like the disorder is kind of, not the best term in terms of people identifying with it, but an injury is something that happens outside to you. So I was at this conference, and while there, I went to DC and went to the Holocaust Museum. And you go into this little elevator and you go up to the 4th floor, and it opens to this picture of the GIs looking in at you. And they all had a 1,000-mile stare. And it was just like a light bulb moment for me. That's what happened to my grandfather. He went into Dachau and he was traumatized. So there was a guy at the conference, Mr. Arundel, who made a movie about fighter pilots. And I went up to him and I said, I'm trying to put all this together in my mind, because when I would look at things, my grandfather went to West Point, and he was always the jokester, and he was always the funny guy, and everybody liked him. And how did he turn into this bitter, angry, practically possessed man? So Mr. Arundel said, okay, you don't understand. He felt shame and guilt. And I said, well, why did he do that? I mean, he liberated these people. in Dachau. He talked to them, he liberated them, he helped them. He said, you don't understand. He felt that way because he was afraid and he couldn't cope with the fear. So then I started putting the pieces together. And I had worked at the VA right after the Vietnam War. And so I just started adding all this stuff up, and I decided this is what I want to do for a living. So I started working with first responders. And through all that, I could see how they would come in so hurt and so wounded and so injured. And through a process of therapy and other, support, they would come out and be better. And in fact, not only that, a lot of them would become transformed. There's a thing called post-traumatic growth, which is basically when you go through a trauma like that, if you're able to heal enough, you actually become better in terms of your personal relationships, your relationship with yourself, your confidence, your spirituality, a whole bunch of things. You can actually become a stronger, better person and, help other people. So that was kind of the basis of this book, that I wanted to show both to first responders and to other people, civilians, that they could come through these traumas and actually grow from them. So that was the whole idea.
All right. Now, first responders, I think that's a fairly new term. I think that I guess maybe everybody knows what it means, but that's firefighters and EMTs and police officers.
Dispatchers.
Oh, so even the people who are not necessarily on the scene, you just picking up the phone and hearing that 911 call could be traumatic.
And so, the 911 operators are really the first responders. I mean, literally, they're not there on scene, but they're the first ones to get the call. So
all right. And how would a first responder get to you?
They know who I am. There's agencies that know who I am that make referrals, and just word of mouth mostly. I mean, I have a website that has my information on it. So, I have no problem getting referrals because they know that I do this for a living and that I am, what is called culturally competent, and that I know how the agencies work, how the people work, how they feel, what happens to them, what happens to their families, because I have a lot of experience with that.
All right. So how many first responders would you say you've treated and listened to their stories that resulted in this book? Are we talking like 10 or 100 or 1,000?
Probably in the thousands.
Thousands. Okay. So is there a pattern? Like when you start to hear the story, does it sound familiar?
Yes. So a lot of them come in and they've had this trauma. It can be, a child dying, and they weren't able to save them. A lot of times they feel helpless in the situation, and they tell themselves, they start out this career telling themselves they're going to help people. They never think they're going to be helpless. And when they're helpless or it's overwhelming emotionally to them, sometimes they will develop post-traumatic stress symptoms. And so they come in, sometimes they feel like they're going crazy. They'll say, I feel like I'm going crazy. And basically what happens is your body remembers the trauma and it will keep acting out the trauma after it's over. So they know that there's nothing happening right then, but their body is going into this traumatic fight or flight experience. So they feel like they're crazy. And so the first thing I do is tell them, no, you're not crazy. This is actually a normal response if you consider the circumstances. And you're a normal person having a normal response to an abnormal situation. So just the fact that they learn that they're not crazy is very comforting to me. Then we can start doing the work of reducing that emotional punch of the trauma.
Well, first responders, I mean, they know a little bit what they're getting into. If you're an EMT, you're going to be going to the scene of a car accident. If you're a police officer, you know that you're going to be shooting at people and maybe you're going to be shooting back. But on the other hand, actually being there and actually doing it, is different. So do they have any training or preparation to, to sort of set to cope with what seems to be a predictable kind of stressor that's a little out of the ordinary?
Well, most police officers think that they're going to get through their entire career without shooting anybody. They don't expect to do that. And most of them, I mean, they think they can handle it. There's a certain kind of personality that was with first responders. I mean, they're risk takers. They tend to be sometimes a little ADD, especially firefighters, which is a good thing. You have to be looking at everything to know where the fire is. And they have a belief that if they do their job right, nothing bad will happen to them. And they kind of have to. Who would do that job if you really thought, I'm going to have to shoot somebody tomorrow? You wouldn't. Civilians don't do that. And so they have a confidence in themselves that they can take care of the problem. And however they got that confidence, it's still there. And what happens with post-traumatic stress injury, and I talk about it in How Heroes Heal, is that they lose that confidence. The event was bigger than they could handle. And it's also cumulative. There's cumulative events.
Yes, I was just going to say, sorry to interrupt, but I was very impressed in the book on how you broke down the categories of different stressors. And one of them was cumulative, just a stress that you can handle, but over and over again, it starts to for example, with minor head injury, we know now that lots of little head injuries can add up to a big one after a while. And there was another category you came up with that resonated with me. I can't remember the particular time it happened to me, but it was administrative abandonment, where I had stuck my neck out and expecting, I think it was the hospital or the school, it was a long time ago, to back me up. And I was super stressed and I had done what I thought was the right thing. And then I came back and instead of being supported, I was criticized. And it's like, whoa, what's the deal here? And I can see how, if I had, when a policeman, when there is a shooting, all of a sudden they're on administrative leave. It's like, whoa, wait a minute. I was doing what you trained me to do. I'm doing my job and now I'm out of a job. Maybe I have to defend myself. So I could see how that could add to a loss of confidence.
Yes.
Sure.
Well, the thing is with first responders is when you join the organization, you're told this is a family, we're going to take care of you. And then all of a sudden they don't. It's shocking. It's they feel very traumatized by it. It's like your mother or your father just saying you're on your own. And so if they find out maybe it wasn't a family to begin with. I think a lot of departments are getting much more sensitive to that and protecting their employees. I mean, it's important to protect your employees when you can. It takes a lot of training to be a first responder, a lot of money, and it's hard to get new recruits. And so, the departments would be better off by defending the people. But, obviously in some circumstances they can't. But, it's a very, very important thing to first responders.
Oh, I agree. In fact, I live in Memphis, Tennessee, and we have been struggling as a city to recruit police officers.
Not alone. You're not alone.
Apparently, this is a nationwide phenomenon.
Yep.
I did a ride along years ago. I took a community police course because I was interested in what they did as a writer. I thought, well, gee, I should know what goes on. Oh, it was terrifying. And I remember once I was in the car and they had a complaint and we were in a bad neighborhood and the police officer, I said, I'm staying in the car. Thank you. Anyway, this a young woman, she just walked up to the door and, knocked on the door. And it's like, you don't know what's on the other side of that door. There was a lot of noise, but it's like, gee, I mean, to do that sort of on a regular basis, like every day, and not know what's on the other side of the door, I think that's pretty scary. Now, in the worst case, the stress and the reaction to these events actually leads to suicidal ideation and suicide. We were talking just, before we started recording about January 6th. And I learned from your book that 4 police officers who were there committed suicide.
Yes.
I mean, that can't be a coincidence. I mean, people do commit suicide, right? But 4 of the 50 officers who were there or something like committing suicide. I mean, that's outrageous. Something bad really happened. So how did that happen?
Well, I don't know the individual reasons. I obviously didn't interview them or their families, but the things that I think, they were put in a situation where they expected to have backup and they didn't. It was this horrible, horrible situation for the nation, and they couldn't control it, so they felt out of control. And there were probably other things too. I mean, they saw their colleagues getting hurt. It was just, I think a lot of it was probably with my grandfather, shame and guilt because they were afraid.
And they were responsible. This makes me think, while we're talking, there was a young woman who was a superstar. She was an ER doc, I believe in New York or New Jersey. And she became overwhelmed in the early days of COVID, where people kept coming in and dying, left and right because they didn't have the facilities and respirators. And she committed suicide. And it became nationwide news. And, up until that point, this woman was pretty solid. She wasn't somebody, she had a history of mental illness, or, she was a super high achiever. And I think she had just become the director of this ER as a young person. But any insight into why one would assume that this is their fault, right?
Because their attitude when they go in, this comes with the territory. They don't learn this. They are this. They think that they can control really difficult circumstances. They think, I am on this planet to help people, and I'm going to help people. And if I do my job right, I will help people. And then all of a sudden they don't, they can't, it's an impossible job. They can't do it right. And according to them.
So rude awakening.
Oh, it's cognitive dissonance is, if I was a good person, if I was a good first responder, I would have taken care of this situation. But, and civilians don't always understand, it's impossible. You cannot do it all the time.
All right. So this is bad, but I was intrigued by your book because the title doesn't say how heroes get overwhelmed and commit suicide. The title says how heroes heal. Yes. So how do we do that?
So I think the thing is, the first thing that I do is talk to them about what is happening to their body, how their brain processes information, what happens when you're on fight or flight, and kind of explain that, normalize it for them. And, a lot of them feel very relieved after they know that they're not losing it, that this is actually something that happens. This is your body's way of protecting you. Fight or flight is there for a reason. It's to keep us alive. And that was what their bodies are going through. And the problem is with the post-traumatic stress injury is their bodies keep doing the fight or flight thing when everything's over. So that's why they feel so distressed. And what happens is they start withdrawing, they start isolating, they start drinking, they do anything to make it go away. And they lose contact with their families emotionally because they just can't, it's just too much stuff. There's too much information. There's a thing that's called emotional numbing, which when you've had so much, you just can't even feel emotional, reactions to your family. So, working on getting them back with that, teaching them what happened to their body, teaching them what happened in the course of the trauma. And, sometimes I have to throw this in. There was one EMT, and he had a long career. And so we figured, just, for chuckles, I said, how many critical incidents do you think you've been in? Not just regular everyday stuff, critical incidents. So he said, well, during a week, I probably had so many. And during a month, I probably had so many. Anyway, we added it all up. I couldn't believe it. It was 46,000. And that wasn't everything. That was just things that were critical. Try and keep your sanity when you've had 46,000 critical incidents. So then in terms of getting better, and I talk about the journey, I have kind of a theory about like the hero's journey. They have to go through first of all, they don't want to do it. They don't want to talk to somebody. They don't want to expose themselves or feel vulnerable. And they have to accept the call to adventure, what I call it, make it an adventure. And then they go through and you work on, finding peers, mentors, people who can help you, reconnecting with people. And that's really important. If they don't reconnect, it's a lot more difficult. So, even just connecting with a therapist is good, just so they start coming out of that shell. And then, working through, a lot of times I work through things that have happened in their past. When I do something called EMDR or brain spotting, or there's other therapies too. There's cognitive behavior therapy. So you try to connect what they're feeling with something they felt before, so it makes sense to them. It's like, oh, I felt that way before. That's why this is happening. And so you eventually pull them out of their shell and get them connected to people again. And then you can, look at the growth. I mean, if their spirituality is important, focus on that. What is going to help them with that? That can be a huge thing. If their family's important, if their, friends, activities that they do, things that make them feel like they have a purpose. So a lot of times when they have post-traumatic stress injury, it's kind of like we say, like what it does is it takes away your soul. It takes away your purpose. So getting them to reattach to something that's important to them. And that helps them feel like a human again.
I'm wondering, I know that there are many veterans and others who end up on disability for PTSD, and listening to you talk, that sounds like the worst possible kind of endpoint, because it's going to perpetuate this state. I mean, obviously they may need disability just for economic reasons, but is there a way to kind of avoid that and get these people back to work?
Well, the ultimate goal is getting them back to life. And, work is great. A lot of them go back to work. A lot of them don't want to quit work, but a lot of them say, I just can't do this anymore. And, they need some kind of economic process to help them support their families. So I focus on trying to, what is your purpose? Okay, even if you decide to retire, what's your purpose going to be? I don't let them get away with just retiring. No, you're too young to not do anything. You're too young to not have a purpose. I don't care what it is. I don't care if it's being a fishing guide. You're helping other people.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Do you think that having, this sounds suspiciously kind of like burnout, which of course is a big topic now in the medical field. It's a little bit different, but in terms of preparation and sort of coping and teaching, as opposed to, a lot of people, at least in the medical field, you start working and you're on your own. And I suspect police officers, you just go to work and deal with it. They don't sit down with a psychologist every week for an hour or ever, until there's some catastrophe. Are there any ways to sort of, I don't know, train or modulate or provide support, before people fall off the cliff?
Well, the problem is if you go in as a psychologist and you say this could happen to you when they're in the academy, they're going to go, nah, it's not going to happen to me. They don't want to hear it. So a lot of people are saying it's changing, but there is a thought that, police officers and other first responders should have a yearly checkup to make sure they're doing okay. And, one of the things I do is after there's a shooting, they will come in on an individual basis and I'll kind of assess what's going on and talk about this is what's happening to your body and so on and so forth. So they kind of understand it better. And they don't, perhaps, one thing that they do is because they don't talk to anybody, because they don't want to be vulnerable, they don't say, oh boy, I'm afraid I messed up or something. So there's another thing that happens after a critical incident called critical incident stress management. And you can talk to them after the incident, and there's a certain flow that you do, and you teach them, what to look for. If this happens to you, call somebody. This, if you're having trouble sleeping, if you're having trouble eating, and you process the thing and get everybody on the same page so that they understand what happened. Because what they will do is they won't tell anybody, I'm afraid I messed up. And then it grinds on them. And that just down the rabbit hole. That can destroy them, just that thought that they messed up. And so if they talk to other people and they find out they didn't mess up or it was an impossible call anyway, just get some reality check from other people.
Right. So some outside help, even not necessarily a psychologist, but someone who can listen and reality check. And
ears are very important.
Right. Well, this has been fascinating. And but before we wrap up, I want to ask you a question that I kind of skipped over in the beginning, and I think will be interesting. Why did you write the book?
Well, I had this idea about how people were getting better, and I wanted for it to be kind of an inspiration so people could read it. And and people have given me feedback that yes, that's what happened to me. So good to know that it happened to somebody else. And I've had civilians read it and say, I didn't realize I had these symptoms because of something that happened to me. And so I wanted people to understand what the process is. That there's hope, they can get better, they can do things to overcome these symptoms and this heartbreaking injury.
And maybe should be required reading at all of the police academies and firefighter schools and all the places because what you've identified is this is going to happen to some people. It's not a fluke thing that when you're exposed to some extraordinary stressor that first responders do routinely, that there is, we're human beings and that there's a vulnerability.
Yes. But there is also, rather than stuffing it, deal with it, talk about it, process it. And it doesn't have to be a mental health person. It can be a peer, as I said, or a family member. Somebody that can handle it.
So, Dr. Wooley, this has been a great conversation. Is there anything you'd like to add before we wrap up?
No, I hope people will read How Our Heroes Heal, and I hope it will be useful to them. The feedback I've gotten so far is that it is, even to civilians and to the families of people in first responders. They may have post-traumatic stress injury. So
right, because they're part of it too. They're part of it too. Yes. Yes. Well, I haven't finished the book, but I have read quite a bit of it. And I will say, as an author, that I think it is very well written. It's clear. You talk about I'm a neurologist. You talk about a lot of neurology. The amygdala's in there and, the reptilian brain, but it's very clear. I think any interested lay person would understand it. And I assume it's available on Amazon and all the usual places.
Yeah, Amazon.
All right. Well, Dr. Wooley, I want to thank you very much for appearing on The Art of Medicine.
Thank you. My pleasure. It was great.
Well, before we close, I'd like to give another thanks to our sponsor, locumstory.com, a resource where providers can get real, unbiased answers about locum tenens. I'm Dr. Andrew Wilner. Thank you for watching The Art of Medicine. This program is hosted, edited, and produced by Andrew Wilner, MD, FACP, FAAN. Guests receive no financial compensation for their appearance on The Art of Medicine. Andrew Wilner, MD, is Associate Professor of Neurology at the University of Tennessee Health Science Center, Memphis, Tennessee. Views, thoughts, and opinions expressed on this program belong solely to Dr. Wilner and his guests and not necessarily to their employers, organizations, or other group or individual. While this program intends to be informative, it is meant for entertainment purposes only. The Art of Medicine does not offer professional financial, legal, or medical advice. Dr. Wilner and his guests assume no responsibility or liability for any damages, financial or otherwise, that arise in connection with consuming this program's content. Thanks for watching. For more episodes of The Art of Medicine, please subscribe. www.andrewwilner.com